This report does not seek to fascinate, it seeks to understand. Understanding is not excusing, it is refusing to let it happen again in the shadows.
A quiet afternoon in a local junior college classroom, surrounded by peers studying photography. He seemed like just another student blending in. Then the homicides began. 4 children vanished, shaking a peaceful community. What does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator? And how does society fail to see it? To untangle this dark web, we must look beyond the initial media panic. Throughout this analysis, we will refer to our subject as the human hunter. Operating within the shadows of Tokyo and Saitama, the subject masked his sinister compulsions behind ordinary routines. The ensuing investigation would expose profound institutional vulnerabilities. He navigated city streets in a dark vehicle, an invisible threat moving in plain sight. The profile of this offender shattered a nation's illusion of absolute safety. Behind closed doors, the subject retreated into a labyrinth of media consumption and isolation. The physical evidence left behind painted a grim portrait of a disturbed mind. Authorities struggled to comprehend the scale of the crisis as evidence mounted. The subject operated with terrifying detachment, collecting silent trophies from his horrific acts. The psychological framework of the profile reveals deep-seated fractures. He manipulated the media and taunted grieving families, ensuring his presence was felt long after the crimes. This investigation delves into the mechanics of his evasion. How did the subject slip through the cracks of a highly structured environment to execute a prolonged campaign of terror? By analyzing the forensic footprint and structural failures of the era, we confront the chilling reality of a predator nurtured by the very society he haunted. To the outside observer, the subject presented a flawless illusion of mediocrity. He was a quiet student, a dutiful son, a ghost moving silently through an affluent household, born into a lineage of regional prominence. His family status provided an immediate shield of respectability. Wealth and reputation formed the perfect camouflage for his internal fracturing. His social integration was entirely passive. He did not charm or manipulate with grand gestures. Instead, he mastered the art of becoming completely invisible in plain sight. A physical anomaly, a congenital defect in his hands, served as an unexpected tool for his deception. It elicited pity and dismissal from peers, deflecting any deeper scrutiny. Society tends to equate physical vulnerability with harmlessness. By leaning into his role as a marginalized, timid outcast, the subject effectively neutralized any suspicion from his community. He navigated the rigorous pressures of the educational system, initially performing as a model student. This early academic compliance cemented his facade as a compliant, harmless youth. Even when his academic performance later plummeted, it was misread as mere teenage burnout. His parents, absorbed in their enterprise, saw only a disappointing son, never a predator. The profile reveals a masterclass in psychological deflection. He redirected attention away from his growing isolation by fulfilling the bare minimum requirements of an ordinary daily routine. Behind the closed door of his bedroom, however, the mask began to slip. He built a private sanctuary, a physical barrier separating his fractured mind from the outside world. His room became a sprawling labyrinth of media and technological escapism. This obsessive collection was dismissed by his family as a mere hobby, a benign introverted fixation. To maintain his facade, he enrolled in a local junior college to study photography. This choice of vocation gave him a legitimate reason to operate behind a lens. The camera became a crucial psychological prop. It allowed him to observe the world without truly participating, a mechanical eye that distanced him from genuine human connection. His environment failed to see the warning signs because they were looking for conventional delinquency. The subject did not rebel. He simply withdrew, evading all behavioral tripwires. The tragic flaw in the community's perception was the assumption that silence equals safety. His complete lack of social friction was, in reality, a symptom of profound detachment. He weaponized his own insignificance. As long as he remained a quiet presence in the background, nobody questioned the dark compulsions gestating in his isolated, confined universe. Institutional blindness played a critical role. The cultural emphasis on outward harmony meant that his family actively ignored the deepening void, preserving their own public image instead. The subject understood this cultural blind spot perfectly. He fed them the quiet, unobtrusive behavior they expected, ensuring they would never look beyond the tightly sealed surface. The death of his primary caretaker shattered this delicate equilibrium. The only tether anchoring his fragile mask to reality snapped, leaving his repressed urges entirely unchecked. Still, the facade held long enough for him to transition into his dark compulsions unnoticed. The predator was now fully formed, hiding behind the face of a forgotten son. He had successfully convinced the world he was a ghost. But as the psychological pressure reached its breaking point, this phantom was about to demand terrifying proof of existence. Detectives systematically matched the localized evidence to the broader string of unsolved disappearances. The mask of the quiet, obedient son collapsed entirely under institutional pressure. The physical evidence forced a confession, resolving the immediate investigative crisis. But capturing the man is merely the prologue. The arrest is only the beginning of what comes next. The genesis of the profile begins with a profound biological vulnerability. Born prematurely, he entered the world bearing a severe congenital defect in his forearms. His wrist joints were permanently fused, preventing upward rotation. This physical anomaly became the cornerstone of his deeply ingrained sense of inadequacy and profound isolation. He was raised within a wealthy, highly influential household. However, this environment was emotionally barren, characterized by a staggering lack of parental presence or affection. With his parents entirely absorbed in their regional enterprise, the subject was left to be raised primarily by his aging grandfather and a hired, marginalized caretaker. During his elementary school years, his physical deformity made him a prime target for peer ostracization. This relentless bullying drove him into deep psychological withdrawal. In an attempt to compensate for his physical limitations, he initially pursued rigorous academic achievement. He sought validation through the highly competitive Japanese educational system. Yet, under immense societal pressure, his academic performance deteriorated dramatically. His ranking plummeted, destroying his aspirations and cementing his internal narrative of absolute personal failure. Retreating to his childhood home, he felt profoundly rejected by his parents and siblings. He perceived that his family valued only social status, ignoring his quiet suffering. Completely alienated within his own home, the subject later admitted to intense suicidal ideation. He believed his voice would never be heard, trapped in a silent void. Within this hostile domestic sphere, his grandfather remained his only emotional anchor. The elderly man was the single figure who offered unconditional acceptance and crucial psychological support. The critical fracture occurred when this sole pillar of stability suddenly passed away. This devastating loss completely shattered the fragile psychological equilibrium the subject had maintained. Plunged into severe depression, his coping mechanisms became intensely morbid. Desperate to retain a physical connection, he secretly consumed a portion of his grandfather's cremated ashes. Stripped of his only human bond, he retreated entirely into a vast, artificial reality. He constructed a fortress of thousands of videotapes, comic books, and horror media, His pathologically regressive behavior soon escalated into physical violence. Demonstrating classic pre-homicidal indicators, he began torturing and eliminating neighborhood animals, testing his capacity for absolute control. The hidden aggression then turned inward toward his own household. When a sibling discovered his voyeuristic behavior, the ensuing confrontation ignited a violent, unrestrained physical assault. This domestic terror continued when his mother confronted him about his debilitating media obsession. Her demands for his social conformity were met with vicious, retaliatory rage. Emboldened by these violent outbursts, the subject severed all remaining ties to societal norms. His empathy had eroded completely, replaced by a cold, calculating predatory instinct. The psychological fractures of his childhood had finally converged. The alienated boy had been fully eclipsed by an angry, isolated man harboring deeply sinister compulsions. He possessed a vehicle unmonitored freedom, and an overwhelming desire to impose his internal nightmare onto the real world. The predator was now hunting in plain sight. We understand the deep structural cracks that built his pathology. But what unimaginable horrors would unfold once he finally decided to cross the ultimate, irreversible line? In profiling a predator, we must strictly separate the modus operandi from the signature. The MO is utility. It is what the subject does to accomplish the crime. The signature, however, is a psychological necessity. It is the ritualistic behavior that satisfies the offender's deepest compulsions, going far beyond the basic requirements of the offense. The subject developed a highly efficient mobile modus operandi. He utilized a dark vehicle to traverse the sprawling urban environments of Tokyo and the surrounding prefectures unnoticed. This vehicular mobility allowed him to operate across vast jurisdictions. He carefully selected isolated locations and targeted a highly specific demographic of extreme vulnerability and physical weakness. The modus operandi relied on deception and passive luring. He manipulated the inherent trust of his targets, ensuring smooth abductions without drawing immediate attention from surrounding bystanders. Once the victim was secured and transported to a remote location, the primary objective of the MO was complete. At this precise moment, his signature behavior activated. The violence itself was mechanical, utilizing basic strangulation to assert immediate and absolute physical dominance over his captives. But the cessation of life was merely a prerequisite. For this profile, the true psychological gratification began post-mortem. He required complete possession of his victims, transforming them from living beings into static, controllable objects of fantasy. A critical component of his signature was visual documentation. He obsessively photographed and filmed the remains, capturing these grim tableaus to feed his deeply fractured internal reality. The illusion of absolute invincibility eventually corrupts every predator. Blinded by his own prolonged success, the subject began to deviate from his highly structured operational patterns. His escalating psychological need for dominance overshadowed his foundational caution. This arrogance inevitably led him to commit critical, unforced errors in plain sight. The meticulous planning that had characterized his early offenses began to erode. He substituted careful surveillance with impulsive, high-risk behavior driven entirely by dark compulsion. Abandoning the protective cover of darkness, he returned to a familiar hunting ground during daylight hours. He targeted new vulnerabilities in a highly populated urban park. The sheer audacity of operating in broad daylight demonstrated a profound detachment from reality. He believed his invisible mask would permanently shield him from discovery. He isolated a young target, initiating his deeply ingrained manipulative routine. He relied on the same deceptive charm that had previously guaranteed his sinister successes. But this time, an unexpected variable disrupted the meticulously planned predatory cycle. The chaotic unpredictability of the real world finally breached his carefully controlled fantasy. A vigilant family member intervened, confronting the subject directly before the abduction could be completed. This sudden loss of absolute control shattered his fragile composure. The confrontation escalated into a brief, frantic physical struggle. Faced with active resistance, the intense cowardice underlying his predatory facade was instantly and completely exposed. Stripped of his calculated dominance, the predator panicked. He fled the immediate area on foot, desperately attempting to vanish back into the surrounding urban labyrinth. In his frantic, adrenaline-fueled escape, he made his most fatal miscalculation. He abandoned his primary tool of mobility and concealment, his dark, conspicuous vehicle. Leaving the car behind severed his only reliable means of evasion. That stationary vehicle provided law enforcement with the ultimate, undeniable physical anchor. The invisible phantom was now tethered to a tangible location, a license plate, and a traceable identity. The extensive police dragnet rapidly focused its attention. Driven by the sheer compulsion to reclaim his operational tool, the subject foolishly returned to the scene. Local authorities were already waiting in the shadows. The apprehension was swift and remarkably anticlimactic. The terrifying phantom who had paralyzed a nation was reduced to a cornered, unremarkable man in police custody. Following the arrest, investigators executed a comprehensive search of his isolated residential sanctuary. They breached the tightly sealed doors of his deeply disturbed private reality. Inside, authorities discovered an overwhelming claustrophobic archive of extreme media consumption. Thousands of stacked video cassettes created towering walls of violent and deeply explicit escapism. Hidden within this massive visual hoard, investigators uncovered the undeniable photographic trophies of his atrocities. The forensic footprint was absolute and utterly damning for him. The camera lens functioned as a psychological barrier, providing a detached, voyeuristic distance. By recording the aftermath, he could perpetually relive the total control he had briefly possessed. The subject's compulsions also manifested in the retention of personal items. He meticulously collected physical trophies from the crime scenes, embedding these artifacts into his private sanctuary. Furthermore, the clinical analysis reveals disturbing post-mortem rituals. The profile engaged in severe biological desecration, attempting to physically absorb the essence of the victims he had conquered. These acts were not driven by utility, but by a horrific internal void. His necrophilic and cannibalistic behaviors were desperate attempts to maintain absolute authority over the dead. But private possession was insufficient. The signature expanded to include psychological warfare against the community. He sought to extend his dominance by terrorizing the families of his victims. He subjected grieving parents to agonizing, silent phone calls lasting for prolonged periods. This auditory torment was a deliberate assertion of his power over their emotional devastation. The subject also orchestrated a sophisticated campaign of written communication. He mailed deeply disturbing packages containing physical evidence and cryptic messages, manipulating the ongoing police investigation. Utilizing a female pseudonym, he engaged in calculated wordplay to taunt the media and authorities. This linguistic camouflage highlighted his simultaneous desire for public notoriety and cowardly concealment. His communications ensured that the psychological terror rippled outward, paralyzing an entire nation. The subject had successfully transformed himself from an invisible outcast into a pervasive societal nightmare. As the complexity of his signature evolved, the frequency and audacity of his attacks increased. He was operating at the peak of his predatory capabilities, seemingly untouchable. However, this escalating psychological need for risk and exposure creates inherent structural flaws. The predator is operating efficiently, but every highly structured system eventually begins to break down. The legal proceedings that followed his apprehension became an unprecedented psychological spectacle. The courtroom was forced to decipher whether it was judging a madman or a calculating predator. During the trial, the subject's behavior was profoundly detached and bizarre. He frequently spoke in disjointed, nonsensical fragments, retreating into an impenetrable state of apparent apathy. He spent hours sketching cartoon figures on the defendant's bench. He persistently blamed his horrific acts on a fictional, animated alter ego, claiming it forced his hand. The defense argued he was operating within a perpetual dream state. This necessitated 3 separate psychiatric evaluation teams to determine his true legal competency and mental accountability. Diagnostic opinions violently clashed. Some experts suggested multiple personality syndromes or schizophrenia, arguing for a state of diminished capacity fueled by extreme, long-term social isolation. However, the court ultimately adopted the assessment of a severe personality disorder. The judges concluded he was fully sane, aware of his actions, and legally responsible. Throughout the exhaustive 16-year judicial process, the profile exhibited an absolute void of empathy. He never offered a single apology or expressed any genuine remorse. He even described his campaign of terror as an act of benevolence. This complete lack of contrition solidified his sentence of death by hanging, handed down in 1997. While the subject languished in a detention center, the fallout from his exposure devastated his family. In traditional culture, such public disgrace demands an ultimate tragic toll. Overwhelmed by societal shame, his father committed suicide, refusing to finance the legal defense. His siblings were forced to sever all ties and erase their own identities. Beyond his immediate family, the shockwaves triggered a massive national moral panic. The media seized upon his massive media collection, demonizing an entire subculture of isolated youth. A rigid stereotype was born, equating extreme introversion and media consumption with latent criminal tendencies. The entire demographic was suddenly viewed as a dangerous, silent threat. This pervasive stigma led to intense law enforcement profiling. Authorities began targeting solitary young men in urban districts, treating benign escapism as a precursor to violent offenses. The case fundamentally shifted modern criminology. It exposed the total failure of traditional policing methods to identify predators who hide not in dark alleys, but in digital isolation. Institutions were forced to adapt to a new reality. The established system could not comprehend an offender driven entirely by internal fantasy rather than conventional criminal motives. Consequently, the publishing and software industries faced intense public scrutiny. To avoid draconian state censorship, these industries rapidly implemented strict self-regulation and content rating systems. The highest court rejected his final appeal in 2006. 2 years later, the execution was carried out, swiftly ending his life without providing any psychological closure. His death removed the physical threat, but the psychological scars remained. He left behind a terrified society forced to reevaluate the deep fractures in its social fabric. The legacy of this profile is one of profound institutional and cultural disruption. He remains the definitive case study of how unseen isolation breeds unchecked, catastrophic violence. With the forensic data collected, the trial concluded, and the societal impact measured, the puzzle is complete. We now have all the elements to finally classify this archetype.
The mystery is over. The trump card is on the table. So, did you recognize him?
The subject we have tracked through these shadows is Tsutomu Miyazaki, widely remembered by history as the Otaku murderer. During his campaign of terror, He communicated with the media and grieving families using the female pseudonym Yuko Amada. This alias was a calculated linguistic game, functioning as a pun for the Japanese phrase, "Imida," translating roughly to "now I'll tell," highlighting the deep-seated exhibitionism of a man desperate for notoriety yet too cowardly to show his face. To truly understand his pathology, we must evaluate him through the Pentagon of evil framework. Over the course of less than a year, Miyazaki claimed the lives of 4 young victims. The profile is defined by a profound, pathological social isolation fueled by a severe obsession with anime and horror media, alongside a congenital deformity in his hands that triggered lifelong feelings of inadequacy. This lethal combination of physical insecurity and digital escapism forged a highly specific predatory archetype. Premeditation, 6 out of 10. Miyazaki demonstrated adequate planning in his early offenses. He utilized his vehicle to scout remote locations, selected highly vulnerable targets, and managed to secure them without immediate detection. He effectively disposed of evidence in the initial stages. However, his planning was not masterfully sophisticated. It relied heavily on the inherent trust of children rather than complex evasion tactics. As his psychological compulsions intensified, his premeditation severely degraded, culminating in an impulsive daylight abduction attempt that lacked any tactical foresight. Signature, 9 out of 10. The psychological compulsions driving Miyazaki entirely eclipsed the utility of his crimes. The homicides themselves were merely a mechanism to obtain absolute control over his targets. His signature was defined by extensive post-mortem rituals, including meticulous visual documentation through photography and videography, the retention of personal trophies, and the psychological torment of his victims' families through mailed letters. These ritualistic behaviors were essential to satisfying his deeply fractured internal reality, representing an almost absolute dominance of signature over methodology. Mobility, 4 out of 10. His geographical reach was moderately limited. He utilized a personal vehicle, a dark Nissan Langley, to navigate between Tokyo and the neighboring Saitama prefecture, granting him the ability to abduct victims and transport them to isolated wooded areas. While this provided him with a functional hunting ground across municipal lines, he did not operate on a national scale or utilize a highly transient lifestyle. His mobility was entirely dependent on a single, highly identifiable vehicle, which ultimately anchored him to a specific region. Resistance, 3 out of 10. Miyazaki exhibited remarkably poor resistance to investigative pressure and confrontation. When intercepted by a vigilant parent during his final abduction attempt, he immediately panicked and fled the scene on foot, abandoning his primary mode of transport. Furthermore, upon his arrest, he offered virtually no psychological resistance, rapidly confessing to the broader series of homicides once in police custody. His facade was exceptionally fragile, collapsing instantly when stripped of his controlled, isolated environment and faced with direct opposition. Impact, 8 out of 10. The societal shockwaves generated by his crimes were monumental. He shattered Japan's illusion of absolute communal safety and initiated a massive national moral panic regarding youth isolation and media consumption. His exposure led to the intense stigmatization of the Otaku subculture, prompting aggressive police profiling and widespread institutional reform. By weaponizing the media and taunting authorities, he paralyzed a nation with fear, leaving a permanent legacy that fundamentally altered Japanese criminology and cultural perceptions of digital escapism. Final score, 30 out of 50. Compiling these metrics, Tsutomu Miyazaki yields a total score of 30 out of 50. This score reflects an offender driven by overwhelming psychological signature and massive societal impact, rather than tactical brilliance or resilience. What does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator? In this case, It took a profound biological vulnerability met with severe emotional neglect, festering within a toxic cocoon of isolation. And society failed to see it because it mistook quiet withdrawal for harmless compliance. We ignored the silent fractures, allowing a phantom to build a nightmare in plain sight until the illusion finally broke.
Some monsters are born in the shadows. Others are the shadow itself. The verdict is etched in stone, but make no mistake, evil never stops. It simply changes its face. Many more monsters await dissection on this channel. Stay vigilant. Case closed.